So, Margaret, for people listening who might not be familiar with it, can you describe Women of Color Global Women's Strike and its connection to Black Women for Wages for Housework and the ways that they took influence or inspiration from the women's strike in Iceland in 1975?
Right. Well, the women's strike in Iceland in 1975 was definitely a seminal moment for all of us. It was also the beginning of the UN Women's Decade, and our network, we were very active in the UN Women's Decade, but we also worked to popularize, actually, I don't know if you know this, the news of the Iceland strike and that slogan of when women stop, everything stops. And one of our first bulletins that we put out actually had that fantastic photo of the women in the capital in Iceland in the square with when women stop, everything stops. And we definitely picked up on that and tried to popularize it and publicize it as much as possible. And Black Women for Wages for Housework, it was kind of late 1974, 75, somewhere in there that we also began. And of course, the Wages for Housework campaign itself began a bit earlier, founded by Selma James. And then as an autonomous network, I helped to co-found Black Women for Wages for Housework a few years later. So we definitely were inspired and influenced by the Iceland strike, and also our involvement in the UN Women's Decade, where we remained very, very active, and we worked in fact for a resolution. Took us about 10 years to win it, but we didn't give up on measuring and valuing the unwaged work that women do in the home, on the land, and in the community. And actually, when we mention the community, we know that not only in the Catholic Church, but in churches worldwide, there's so much work that women do that's also unpaid, not recognized, et cetera, in the church. So when we talked about measuring that work in the community, the reason we didn't just say in the home or on the land with agricultural work, but in the community, was to precisely highlight and say the work that women do as volunteers in the community, whether it's in the church, community-based organizations, et cetera, that work has value to society, and that should also be measured and valued. So the role that Black Women for Wages for Housework played, and we coordinate the Women of Color Global Women's Strike, and I'll say a little bit about how the strike itself came to be with the 2000 strike. But we went to the 1980 conference, UN conference in Copenhagen, where we tried to get language through and failed. And we learned our lesson, because after that we realized that we need an actual presence, official presence in the United Nations. So we formed an organization. First it was Housewives in Dialogue, then we changed it to Women in Dialogue. We applied for official status in the UN, and we were granted what was then category 2. I think now they call it special status, but that gave us access to be able to go in and lobby delegates, et cetera, including the Vatican, by the way, which we did lobby on several occasions on this particular issue. And then I think we were aiming, I think it was paragraph 1203 in Copenhagen. So then what we did is we mobilized internationally of an international petition that says women count women's work, and everywhere that we are. And we had it in several different languages, et cetera, and we gathered global support. And with that effort, in 1985, we went to Nairobi to the mid-decade conference on women, much more armed, hate to use that military term, but with our petition and with the supporters. Of course, it was in Nairobi, Kenya, and the whole issue of unwaged work is huge on the continent of Africa, given the workload that women on the continent carry. So it was a very, very popular issue in the non-governmental organization conference. But by then, we were also lobbying in the official conference. And it was there that we won language that wasn't exactly what we wanted. It was compromise language, but we did win it with the support, especially of countries in the global south. And then we prepared, we knew that we had more work to do, so we continued our local campaigning. There isn't time to get into it now in the several countries where we are based. And we started organizing something called Time Off for Women, which was a kind of a strike. And we did that on UN Day, October 24th. And we did that in several countries, in the US and other places where we were. So that was, in a way, a kind of a mini strike. It was like a lead up to a strike. And we called it Time Off for Women, right? And got quite a lot of support. And in fact, several of the activities that we did also in collaboration with some churches as well. And then we prepared then for the final UN conference, which was 1975. And the women in Iceland had a second strike. 75 was one, and that second one was in, was it 85 or was it 90? Anyway, they did a second strike, and you should talk with them about that. And we used that as well, because, and we always pointed out that when the women in Iceland went on strike, everything shut down, right? The airlines, the newscasters were there with the children running around trying to give the news. I mean, it was fantastic. And it showed the whole world the possibility that we have as women, the power that we have when we withdraw our labor. Right. So then in preparation for 1995, again, we mobilized, we did our global petition, and also Black Women for Wages for Housework. We organized something called the International Network of Women of Color, in which we brought together women of color, you know, across from several different countries, again, around this particular issue. And by the time we got to Beijing with a delegation of over 57 women or so, multiracial, different sectors of people, we had the support of over 1,200 non-governmental organizations worldwide, which represented millions of women. And we had also negotiated with the US delegation that was headed by Hillary Clinton. We had a few meetings in the White House where we were pushing for language. By the time we got to Beijing, we had language that was compromise language, which, you know, we did with the US. But then when we got there, we found out that the US actually, and the issue was so controversial, it went into a separate conference room for negotiation. And we had language that we thought we had agreed with the United States. We had a few meetings in the basement of the White House hashing this out. But lo and behold, when we got to Beijing, the language itself, you could well imagine, because most of the work done in the world is actually unwaged. So we're looking at a huge swath, not only work done in the home, but work done in the churches, work done in agriculture, and there was generally a freak out by the nations with some power in the world. But we found, so it became very controversial, and it had to be negotiated in a separate conference room. We found out that in that negotiation, the US, they were not negotiating the language that was agreed to, but in fact was negotiating the opposite of it. And how we knew that, I headed our lobby team. I found out because there were members of our team that were also part of government delegations in CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, as well as Italy, interestingly enough. So I was getting regular feedback and reports about what was going on. It's an interesting story, no time to tell, but we wound up in a way busting the US and exposing the fact that they were negotiating not in good faith with what was agreed to. We also did a bit of a mini strike, if you would believe this, in the UN building in Beijing, in China. And the way we did it is that we found out where the conference room was. We lined the hallways on both sides we wore t-shirts that said women count, count women's work in English as well as in Chinese. So that every time the delegates had to go into the room to negotiate or leave for eating breaks, so we were there. We had to do a silent vigil. If not, we would have been arrested by the authorities, right? So we did a silent vigil and we stayed there throughout the entire negotiation. So they had to deal with us, if you know what I mean. We won the language. We got through, if you would believe it. So finally in 1995, the end of the UN Women's Decade, and with the power of the Iceland women's strike behind us and the power of women coming together from religious networks, agricultural networks, grassroots women, welfare mothers, we were able to win that language. And then following that, after 95, there were some countries like in Trinidad and others that started to work on implementing that resolution. Governments, including the US, started doing time use surveys. I don't know if they've done that in the church, but excuse me, they really should. Meaning listing all of the jobs that are done. What is the economic value of that work? And therefore calculating the contributions women, for example, in the church are making to the church, right? And we also said, you can't count one job at a time. You have to count simultaneous tasks. And I'm sure that is true for the women who are working in the church at the same, it's very hard. It's like doing housework. It's hard to do one thing at a time. We have to multitask. Women in the church, I'm sure, know that very, very well.
Very well.
Yeah. So then by 2000, the women in Ireland called for a national strike in Ireland. And they contacted us because we had a global network for support. And we said, yes, absolutely. We are going to work to globalize this. And so in 2000, we began the global women's strike. And we had a set of demands. We went in the global South and the global North. In India, they had massive women in the countryside, 500 villages of Dalit and other women involved in it. In the Western countries, it was a little difficult because just people getting used to the idea of striking, right? And all of that. But what we decided to do is that worldwide, we would all take action together on March the 8th, along with the Irish women. And our basic demand had to do again with women count women's work and the valuation of women's work. And so every year since 2000 on March 8th, we organized as the Global Women's Strike. And lo and behold, by 2017, I think, the International Women's Strike began. They certainly knew of the Global Women's Strike, and we immediately said absolutely yes. We didn't see it as competitive or anything like that. We are part of this. And so we participated also in the International Women's Strike in the US. I was part of the coordinating group for International Women's Strike in the US. We had a very, very progressive platform that included, by the way, the call for measuring, valuing, but not only that, resources, money for unpaid work that we're doing. And and in Los Angeles, we've actually kept that up. I mean, 2017, 2018, even this year, we squeaked in right before COVID hit on March the 8th. And so in other words, you could see how one thing built from the Iceland strike, the UN Women's Decade, us coming together with the women in Ireland in 2000 for their strike, and continuing trying to popularize and move forward the idea of women's strikes to the international women's strikes that then happened in many countries around the world. In Chile, millions of women on the street. In Spain, millions on the street, etc. So then COVID hit, and it's a whole different world.
Right. Thank you. That's such a helpful history, just like a brief history of how that really became a global movement, and that's inspiring for us. And I the next question I would ask, and I will make this the last question, cognizant of our time, is what lessons do you think that women in the Catholic Church can learn from these movements to name and call for recognition and compensation for the work of women, knowing that Catholic women have, as you said, been involved in these larger, broader societal movements, but as we focus specifically on the church and an organization that is so hierarchical and undemocratic, what lessons would you say that we could take forward with us?
Well, I certainly hope that you continue your conversation about a strike, because I also think that it would really be extremely useful, just as a lesson, because that's what we did. We started listing the work. We started listing, this is what we actually do, okay? And then we pushed for example, in the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we met with them several times on these time use surveys to say, these are the jobs, the economic value. Let's just look at the economic value of this. If you had to pay somebody to do this work, and interestingly enough, by the way, we found out that insurance companies were selling insurance that, well, if you died, let's say if I died or a mother, or whatever, this is what it would cost the family to replace her services, right? Yeah. So they were actually selling insurance on that basis. So what happens in the context of the church if all of the women who went there, did the flowers, organized? I myself was raised in the Anglican church because I'm from Barbados. That's a whole other story, the relationship with England. But I think the Anglican church in the US, the Episcopal church, comes a little bit closer to the Catholic church in a way, just in terms of what the mass looks like and that kind of thing. But I think all of the work, my mother was part of the Mothers Union in the church. And so much of her time, went into that, with the Sunday school, with the flowers, with the cleaning, with this, that. I mean, like, there was nothing practically that happened in the church except maybe giving out the communion and whatnot that women were not involved in. So I would suggest one lesson would be to start listing that work, listing what the contribution to the church is of that work, right? What the value of it is, and really continue that conversation, because they have got to, the powers that be in the church, very hierarchical. Interestingly, the Pope came out, the present Pope, for civil unions. So we'll see in terms of same-sex couples, where that goes in relation to women's rights within the church. But I think the lessons from Iceland and all of us who've been involved in the strikes, we know that it is when we withdraw our labor, not only we withdraw our labor, but we point out the value of it. That really is the way change happens. So that would be an advice for those of you working in the church. But the other thing on this issue is, they're the women who volunteer and work specifically in the church. And then they're the women who come and just attend the services. So the other thing that we have tried to do is to figure out a way to get support across sectors and across divides, so that building support from parishioners, as well as the women who are in the church, but also with the community. You know what I mean? Just women, just generally in the community. And I think that would also be a boost for your efforts, because none of us can, I don't think, and our experience in the work that we have done over so many decades, it's very difficult to achieve something big when you're more isolated, or you're in your own lane, to put it that way. We have to get out of our lanes. We have to figure out, where can we find common ground across race, across nations, across sectors. In your instance, with women who are working in the church, parishioners, women parishioners in the church, women in the community, those who may want to come to church, but don't because they are turned off by the male domination and hierarchy, et cetera, and quite honestly, don't understand it. And when you look at the role of Guadalupe, for example, the image of Guadalupe, and the understanding of the role of the Virgin Mary and whatnot. I mean, there are so many cultures, including in indigenous Black traditions, I'm finding, but also indigenous Native American traditions, there's a figure that's very similar to her. It's like across the board. And when we're all in trouble, and when we need help, and we need sustenance, and we need caregiving in a certain way, who do we turn to? We turn to her, right? And why is she such an important figure in the church, but yet women within the church are treated in a certain way and not able to do certain things? So it's a kind of a double standard is all I'm saying. So the reason I mention her is that I think that in a way she represents so much across nationalities, across cultures, and is something that every woman, whether you're a mother or not, you get and you relate to. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that's useful for you with what you're trying to do and move forward. And I think networks like ours would be very not only intrigued, but would definitely want to support the work of women in the church, because there's an interrelationship between what happens to you there and what happens to us on the outside. It really is one piece of a whole. The devaluation of women in the church is a devaluation of all women, and even a devaluation of Guadalupe and Maria, the mother. And we can't tolerate it any longer.
Yeah, I hear you 100% on that. We have been working so hard kind of to do a couple of the things that you've named. One, to point out that the church's treatment of women has bearing on all of the questions of women's rights in all communities worldwide. Like the Vatican, as you know, the Holy See, as a representative at the UN, is not a credible voice for women's rights, given the way it treats women in its own system. And also, we've been trying, and cognizant, and always trying to become more aware and do better of recognizing the harm that white women have perpetuated in the movement, to also lift up and say this is not just a white American women's movement, that there, like you said, there are so many communities from all around the world that have this strong connection to the divine feminine and have this reverence for women that are looking for that in the church, and that we are trying to tap into that and lift that up and say that's what we're speaking to. So I really appreciate you saying that.
I should say one other thing too, not to add. What we have found is that women moving up in the hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean that women at the bottom gain.
Yes.
It's a question of where you're going and who you're taking with it. Because if you were just there to prop up the system as it stands now and defend it, and I'm sure there are even women in the church who are doing that, who will defend the hierarchy as it stands now. No. Okay. So I just wanted to mention that a lot of people have this thing, oh, well, if we only had, X number of women in government and prime ministers and this and that. And we look at Margaret Thatcher and we look at Golda Meir, it's like, no, okay. Starting at the bottom with really the grassroots, as you said, I was so happy you used that word, of the women in the church who are doing, the ongoing day in and day out stuff, starting with them and their needs and their demands and building from the bottom up as opposed to the top down is really, really important, I think. If not, your movement can turn into something that you didn't intend for it to be at the start.
That is a potential pitfall, and one that we really try to pay attention to, because, within the church, theologically speaking, for us, like, the grassroots is the church, is the people of God. And so it's important to us that that's where we focus our attention, like you said, and that's where the energy comes from. I'm really glad you said that.
Right, and you do God's work as opposed to just promoting and maintaining a hierarchy.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
That's quite all right. You're doing important work.
Thank you. You as well. So thank you.
And stay safe.
You as well. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Take care now.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.